Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher, Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Caroline.
So this week there's been growing discussion about the need for an integrity commission federally following the resignation of New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian last week. And the state's new Premier, Dominic Perrottet, has made changes to the reopening of the state. So we'll talk about that in a sec. But just first, there's news that the French ambassador is returning to Australia. How should we interpret that news? Is it a sign that all has been forgiven for Australia tearing up the multi-billion-dollar submarine contract?
Certainly, I think the government will be anxious to interpret it in a very positive way. But I think from what the ambassador is saying and the French government is saying, their annoyance is still very deep. And I heard the ambassador saying that the Australians really needed to mend this relationship. So the onus from the French seems to be still on the Australian side to soothe these deeply hurt feelings.
Okay, let's turn to New South Wales and its new Premier, Dominic Perrottet. What's his relationship like with the Prime Minister? And how will they get along?
I think from what we've seen, Dominic Perrottet is pretty forthright guy. He's certainly been outspoken when there's been discussion about aid to New South Wales, federal aid, and he's thought that that's not been enough. He's put New South Wales' view very strongly. So I think he will stand up to the Prime Minister if he feels the need to. He's made the point he's not going to be a doormat in his terminology. On the other hand, he's a man after Scott Morrison's own heart when it comes to speeding up the emergence from COVID, getting the economy back to normal. He's done some tweaking of the New South Wales roadmap in his very first days as Premier to make it somewhat more liberal. So I think that from Scott Morrison's point of view, in terms of that relationship, it'll probably work quite well with both sides recognising that there's going to be some forthright talking on occasion. More broadly, it'll be interesting to see how the fall of Gladys Berejiklian works out for the Prime Minister. She obviously was a politician with strong support in New South Wales, and Scott Morrison needs to pick up seats in that state at the election next year, and Gladys Berejiklian would have probably been an asset in that mission. Whether the new Premier will be to the same extent, well, that remains to be seen.
You mentioned that, he's made changes to the reopening strategy for the state. This has raised some concerns, though, in regional areas where there are lower vaccination rates. And the leader of the Nationals, Peter Toole, was on the radio this morning, trying to slow down that process, warning that these communities are more vulnerable. Do you think that the New South Wales health system and regional health systems will cope with this quicker opening?
There's been discussion, of course, for weeks now about the impact on the health systems of reopening. Now, whether regional systems will cope in particular areas, I think remains to be seen. Obviously, it's a balancing act here. I think in general, the new Premier wanted to put his stamp on things, but he hasn't been drastically radical on the other hand. But in terms of the health system, of course, health ministers a week or so ago wrote to the federal government saying they desperately needed more money for their systems. This prompted a strong response from the Prime Minister towards Queensland, which was indicating that it really couldn't open its border till the hospitals were in a good state, and they weren't at the moment. The federal government's response to that was that there'd been plenty of time and indeed plenty of federal money to get the hospitals in a much better state, and the fact they were feeling under pressure now in Queensland, where there was virtually no COVID, was really, they were saying, an indictment on the state government. So hospital funding is a big argument, and I think if when we open, the pressure really comes on hospitals in various places, and of course Victoria, which has got a lot of cases, is having a potential problem with its hospitals, then I think this will be an issue front and centre.
So do you think the federal government will eventually have to give the states some more money for hospitals?
It's certainly holding out at the moment, but what we've seen, of course, throughout COVID is that in the long run, when the rubber hits the road, as it were, the federal government does have to produce more money, but we'll see how this works out.
Let's now talk about the need for a federal integrity commission. So that, Gladys Berejiklian's resignation last week has sparked a lot of debate about that, whether or not it's necessary. The Federal Nationals leader, Barnaby Joyce, this week came out and said that it wasn't necessary. What do you think? Is he right?
I think that the federal government would prefer not to have an integrity commission. But on the other hand, it is committed to one. And it said that it will introduce the legislation before Christmas. I can't see that getting through before the election. There's just not going to be much time, and it's quite possible we'll have a March election, which would mean it certainly wouldn't have a hope of getting through this term. But I think that the public certainly do want an integrity commission. In the political class, the Berejiklian experience has divided people about whether, in fact, the New South Wales ICAC is a plus or a minus, as it were, to the political system. But generally, the public think that we need more mechanisms to ensure that politicians behave properly and undertake proper processes. And of course, we've seen various scandals that just disillusion people. Now, the model that the federal government has put up has come under a lot of attack. And this week we saw criticism from a public integrity think tank, which is heavy on legal expertise. So there's a lot of debate to go. We haven't seen the final model yet that the government is proposing, but we certainly know that it will be much weaker than the alternative that Labor is urging, and therefore I think that this Integrity Commission is going to be an issue at the election. Either it won't be passed, so it'll still be very live in terms of debate, or if the government's legislation were to be passed before the election, I think Labor would be saying, well, we'll give this body more teeth.
So it's potentially an issue that Labor can wedge the government on.
Potentially, and there's another element too here, Caroline, and that is that we're seeing a move for a number of independents to run in Liberal seats. Now, climate change is their big issue, or will be their big issue, but integrity will also be something that they will be pushing, and that will fuel this debate.
The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has come out strongly supporting Gladys Berejiklian. Could this be a vulnerable point for him in the long term?
Look, I doubt that it will backfire on him. He cast his remarks in pretty broad terms. Reading between the lines, he obviously thinks that she was badly done by, but nevertheless, I think his comments, his praise, while very strong, was general enough that that won't be a particular issue as far as he's concerned. That is the words that he's used.
Okay, look, thanks, Michelle, so much, and we'll talk again in a fortnight.
Thanks, Caroline.